Chapter 2, Skepticism and Conservatism are the Abolition of Matter. Locke Wr is a political philosopher, whose main concern was to establish and justify bourgeois political liberties and the rights of bourgeois property. In pursuit of these objects, he never concerned himself much with allied questions of religion. However, such ch2 remained, and some of those who professed themselves impressed by Locke's theory of the human understanding were inclined to deduce from it skeptical conclusions about our knowledge of God and the human soul. Yet the bourgeois revolution, which demanded a scientific culture led to the triumph of science over church authority, at the same time clung to religion and to the authority of a reformed church. Anything savoring of atheism was abhorrent, and while the new bourgeoisie, in the most revolutionary way, set out to destroy feudal forms of ownership and feudal institutions and ideas, they took great care that the social position of privileged classes should remain secure. Church and state, they realized, must remain the pillars of society, for the new capitalist society, then in process of formation, could no more do without religion than it could without science. Locke's successor, George Berkeley, a theological student at Trinity College, Dublin, who afterwards became a bishop of the Church of England in Ireland, made it his concern to refute the view that the acceptance of the principles and methods of science must lead to a view of the world in which religious beliefs have no place. The full title of Berkeley's principal philosophical work was A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, wherein the chief causes of error and difficulty in the sciences, with the grounds of skepticism, atheism and irreligion, are inquired into. In the very title of his work, Berkeley proclaimed that his purpose was to deal with the relations of science and religion, and to remove those errors in the concept of science which appeared to involve anti-religious consequences. The reconciliation of science and religion was his first avowed aim. Locke had maintained that the immediate objects of knowledge are our own ideas, but that these ideas are produced by the action upon us of external material things, and that at least our ideas of primary qualities are copies of the qualities of external bodies. It is easy to see the inconsistency in this doctrine, for if only our own ideas are the objects of knowledge, how can we possibly know which ideas resemble external objects and which do not? This inconsistency permits two opposite lines of criticism of Locke's doctrine of ideas. On the one hand, he could be criticized in that, having said that ideas are the products of the action of external objects and are copies of such objects, he nevertheless maintained that knowledge is limited to the relations between ideas and that the substance of objective things is unknowable. This line of criticism was afterwards taken up by the revolutionary wing of the French Enlightenment, by Holbach, Helvetius and, above all, Diderot, and led to openly materialist conclusions. On the other hand, he could be criticized in that, having said that knowledge is limited to the world of our own ideas, he nevertheless maintained that these ideas afford us some knowledge of the external material world, and this line of criticism was that adopted by Berkeley. When we perceive any sensible object, what we are aware of is nothing but the existence in our consciousness of certain combinations of sensations. What can be meant, then, Berkeley asked, by the existence of a material object, external to the perceiving mind, corresponding to our sensations? The table I write on exists. That is, I see and feel it, and if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning thereby that if I was in my study I might perceive it, or that some other spirit actually does perceive it. There was an odor, that is, it was smelt, there was a sound, that is, it was heard, a color or figure, and it was perceived by sight or touch. That is all I can understand by these and the like expressions. It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men, Berkeley continued, that houses, unrealm fiveth spit and a word all sensible objects, have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by our understanding. For what are the forementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense, and what do we perceive besides our own ideas or sensations, and is it not plainly repugnant that any one of these, or any combination of them, should exist unperceived? 4. He went on to argue against Locke's contention that our ideas are copies of the qualities of external material things. I answer, an idea can be like nothing but an idea, a color or figure can be like nothing but another color or figure. Again, I ask whether these supposed originals, or external things, of which our ideas are the pictures or representations, be themselves perceivable or no? If they are, then they are ideas, and we have gained our point. But if you say they are not, I appeal to anyone, whether it be sense, to assert a color is like something which is invisible, hard or soft like something that is intangible, and so of the rest. 8. Berkeley was able very soon to dispose of Locke's distinction between primary qualities, which allegedly inhere in material objects independent of the mind, and secondary qualities which are merely subjective. I desire anyone to reflect, and try whether he can, by any abstraction of thought, conceive the extension and motion of a body without all other sensible qualities. Extension, figure and motion, abstracted from all other qualities, are inconceivable. Where therefore the other sensible qualities are, there these must be also, to wit, in the mind, and nowhere else. As for Locke's conception of substance as the substratum which supports the various qualities of material things, Berkeley asserted that this was a completely meaningless and incomprehensible abstraction. If we inquire into what the most accurate philosophers declare themselves to mean by material substance, we shall find them acknowledge they have no other meaning annexed to those sounds but the idea of being in general. The general idea of being appeareth to me the most abstract and incomprehensible of all other. So that when I consider the two parts or branches which make the signification of the words material substance, I am convinced there is no distinct meaning annexed to them. Here Berkeley turned the tables on Hobbes' assertion that substance incorporeal is a meaningless expression. It is material substance that is now asserted to be a meaningless combination of words. In this assertion Berkeley first formulated the contention, which has been repeated many times since, that matter is a meaningless abstraction. Materialism is condemned as a doctrine based on unintelligible abstraction, confused, meaningless, nonsensical. Finally, Berkeley asserted, if there were external bodies, it is impossible we should ever come to know it, and if there were not, we might have the very same reasons to think there were as we have now. And so his conclusion was demonstrated. Some truths there are so near and obvious to the mind that a man need only open his eyes to see them. Such I take this important one to be, viz. That all the choir of heaven and furniture of earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind. Consequently, so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind, or that of any other created spirit, they must either have no existence at all, or else subsist in the mind of some eternal spirit. It being perfectly unintelligible, and involving all the absurdity of abstraction, to attribute to any single part of them an existence independent of a spirit. 6. Berkeley hastened to defend himself against the imputation that there was anything paradoxical, or contrary to common sense and experience, about this conclusion. It were a mistake to think that what is here said derogates in the least from the reality of things. We detract nothing from the received opinion of their reality, and are guilty of no innovation in this respect. The difference is that, according to us, the unthinking things perceived by sense have no existence distinct from being perceived. But while the concept of matter has no basis in experience, its chief use is as an aid to the enemies of religion. How great a friend material substance has been to atheists in all ages, it were needless to relate. All their monstrous systems have so visible and necessary a dependence on it, that when this cornerstone is removed, the whole fabric cannot choose but fall to the ground, insomuch as it is no longer worthwhile to bestow a particular consideration on the absurdities of every wretched sect of atheist. ch2. On the other hand, the articles of the Christian faith can be much more readily accepted, once the prejudice of the existence of matter is removed. Many objections have been used against Christian dogmas, from the creation to the resurrection of the dead, on the grounds that they assert impossibilities. But, take away this material substance, and mean by body that which every plain ordinary person means by the word, to wit, that which is immediately seen and felt, which is only a combination of sensible qualities and ideas, and then their most unanswerable objections come to nothing. Indeed, matter being once expelled out of nature drags with it so many skeptical and impious noddings, such an incredible number of disputes and puzzling questions, which have been thorns in the sides of divines as well as philosophers, and made so much fruitless work for mankind, that if the arguments which we have produced against it are not formed equal to demonstratin, as to me they evidently seem, yet I am sure all friends of knowledge, peace and religion have reason to wish they were. In this way, then, Berkeley refuted all those who were trying to draw religious conclusions from what they supposed to be a scientific attitude. Such wretched atheists supposed that science was about the objective material world, its constituent laws, which are independent of human thought, will insensiten. When so interpreted, it is true that science is materialistic and may seem to be irreconcilable with any idealist or religious doctrines, but such an interpretation is absurd. Scientific results are, indeed, valid and useful, but we must interpret them correctly. They deal only with sensitants, which come to us in certain orders and combinations, the rules and laws of which the sciences discover. Science has no other object, and therefore nothing it can establish can ever possibly contradict the main tenets of religion and idealism. 2. The road to solipsism, Berkeley's circumscription of science and reconciliation of science and religion was not, however, entirely consistent, any more than Locke's doctrine had been consistent. For not content with showing that science could not overthrow religion, Berkeley tried to develop his philosophical principles as a justification of the fundamental tenets of religious faith, having made out that matter does not exist, and that our sensitants are therefore not caused by the action upon us of external material objects. Berkeley was led to speculate upon the real origin of our sensitants, and of the order and combinaton which is observable amongst them. We must distinguish, he declared, between sensible objects, the existence of which consists only in being perceived, and the soul or spirit, which is an active being, whose existence consists, not in being perceived, but in perceiving ideas and thinking. It is evident, he continued, that the far greater part of the ideas or sensations perceived by us are not produced by, or dependent on, the wills of men. There is therefore some other spirit that causes them, since it is repugnant that they should subsist by themselves. Therefore nothing can be more evident than the existence of God, or a spirit who is intimately present to our minds, producing in them all that variety of ideas or sensations which continually affect us. Following up this line of speculation, Berkeley was led to postulate another mode of cognition, additional to that derived from the senses, and this he called cognition through notions, as distinct from ideas. We may not, I think, strictly be said to have an idea of an active being, or of an action, although we may be said to have a notion of them. The world is spiritual, but we do not know spirit, either our own souls, or God, through ideas implanted on the senses, but through notions. Now in this Berkeley was obviously inconsistent, for if it is illegitimate to infer the existence of the material world as the ground of our experience, it must be equally illegitimate to infer the existence of God. If all knowledge is derived from sense, how can knowledge of God and the soul be allowed? Or if we are allowed a notion of spirit, why is it absurd to have a notion of matter? If the words material substance are meaningless, surely the same must go for infinite spirit. David Hume, in his treatise of human nature, said about the removal of these inconsistencies of Berkeley, we may observe that 'tis universally allowed by philosophers, and is besides pretty obvious of itself, that nothing is really present to the mind but its perceptions or impressions and ideas, and that external objects become known to us only by those perceptions they occasion. Now, since nothing is ever present to the mind but perceptions, and since all ideas are derived from something antecedently present to the mind, it follows that 'tis impossible so much as to conceive or form an idea of anything specifically different from ideas or impressions. Let us fix our attention out of ourselves as much as possible, let us chase our imagination to the heavens, or to the utmost limits of the universe. We never really advance a step beyond ourselves, nor can we conceive any kind of existence, but those perceptions, which have appeared in that narrow compass. By impressions Hume meant the objects of sense, and by ideas, the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning the objects of the mind. Being thus strictly limited to our own impressions and ideas, any external reality beyond the narrow compass of impressions and ideas is absolutely inconceivable. In other passages Hume tried to show in some detail how the belief that external material things exist arises solely from the persistence and recurrence of certain groupings of impressions. Such experiences dispose us to believe that corresponding permanent external things exist, but we have no evidence that anything exists beyond impressions and ideas. When submitted to strict analysis, the supposition of such existence turns out to be logically baseless. So far Hume agreed with Berkeley, but he went on to point out that, on the same principles, not only do external material objects disappear, but the knowing mind, or the soul, disappears as well. Self or person, Hume wrote, is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have reference, and so he asked, after what manner therefore do they belong to self, and how are I connected with it? For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind, that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions. And so just as permanent external material objects are reduced to collections of fleeting impressions, the same applies to the permanent self, or soul, or mind. We may observe that what we call a mind is nothing but a heap or collection of afferent perceptions, united together by certain relations, and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity, so much, therefore, for Berkeley's notion of spirit. It has gone the same way as matter, and nothing remains but the series of fleeting impressions. The train of thought which led from Locke, through Berkeley, to Hume, was a train of thought which relentlessly reduced the scope of what was asserted to exist. Thus Locke allowed three classes of being, so to speak, impressions and ideas, the self, to which these belong, and material objects, which they represent. Berkeley reduced these three circles to two, impressions and ideas, and the self or soul. Hume left standing only impressions and ideas, which belong to nothing and represent nothing. Having arrived at this conclusion, Hume went on to develop it further, with the same relentless consistency. He next attacked the idea of causality. He pointed out, as, indeed, Berkeley had pointed out before, that sense impressions are quite inert, and do not contain any element of power or efficacy or necessary connection, whereby one can produce or cause another. They simply follow one another, and enter into combinations, without any causal connection. From this Berkeley concluded that they must be caused by God. But Hume concluded that, since our knowledge is limited to whatever is presented to us by the senses, the idea of causality as some kind of necessary objective connection between events independent of our consciousness of them, must be an illusion. All events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined but never connected. Finally, Hume went on to conclude that, the objects of knowledge being limited to fleeting impressions, the knowledge of any one person at any moment is limited to the existence of his own impressions at that moment. There are no principles of reason which would allow us to infer from the impressions of the moment the existence of anything else, past, present, or future. If, therefore, the philosopher is determined to admit nothing except what can with certainty be demonstrated, he can admit nothing whatever, neither the external world, nor other people, nor even his own continuous existence, as presented by his memory beyond those perceptions which are immediately present to consciousness. Here, therefore, there appeared the logical consequence of consistently following up Locke's original doctrine QF ideas, that consequence is solipsism. It is a disturbing consequence, and has disturbed followers of the empiricist tradition of philosophy ever since. I am at first affrighted and confounded with that forlorn solitude in which I am placed in my philosophy, Hume exclaimed. 3. Knowledge, belief and superstition. Hume did not, however, believe that nothing existed except the momentary impressions in his own mind. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends, and when, after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold, and strained, and ridiculous, that I cannot find it in my heart to enter into them any further. Here, then, I find myself absolutely and necessarily determined to live, and talk, and act like other people in the common affairs of life. His conclusion was, therefore, that what can be known with certainty, and what one must believe, are two different things, and that it is in practice impossible to base beliefs exclusively on what can with certainty be known. The whole point of Hume's philosophy consists in this. What is the nature of belief? Hume asked. What is the difference between believing or assenting to an idea, and not believing it? He answered, an idea assented to feels different, and this different feeling I endeavor to explain by calling it a superior force, or vivacity, or solidity, or firmness, or steadiness. Belief is a matter of feeling, rather than reason. It is something felt by the mind, which distinguishes the ideas of the judgment from the fictions of the imagination. It gives them more force and influence, makes them appear of greater importance, infixes them in the mind, and renders them the governing principles of all our action. I've had, as to why some ideas attain such vivacity as to become beliefs. Hume considered that this circumstance ultimately derives from their association with sense impressions. It is the repeated occurrence of certain combinations of impressions which engenders the firm belief in the existence of stable external objects, and similarly, the recurrence of certain sequences of impressions leads to the belief in causal connection. Of course, social custom and education enforce certain beliefs such as religious beliefs, but these beliefs, too, owe their vivacity, in the last analysis, to association with sense impressions. Thus religious beliefs are kept alive by association with the lively impressions produced by religious ceremonies, and are apt to fade away without rituals to induce and reinforce them. In this connection, Hume was the first to draw a sharp distinction between propositions which are demonstrated in a logical or mathematical way, and beliefs in matters of fact, which cannot be so demonstrated. It is impossible, he said, for the imagination to conceive anything contrary to a demonstration, but in reasonings from causation, and concerning matters of fact, this absolute necessity cannot take place. As regards matters of fact, therefore, we can have no demonstrations or proof, and all that Hume claimed to have proved, was to have proved this necessary truth. If you demand conclusive proof of matters of fact, then all you can say with certainty is that your impressions of the moment exist at the moment you are aware of them. Hume's object, then, as he made very clear, was not to tell us to stop believing in the existence of material objects, of other people, of past history, and so on. For he insisted, on the contrary, that we cannot help but assent to those ideas, which are enlivened by the whole content and sequence of our experience. His object was rather to destroy the false idea that certain beliefs are demonstrable when they are demonstrably not so, and to puncture the fanaticism so often associated with unfounded pretensions to infallible knowledge. He proceeded to stress the distinction between what he called philosophy, meaning in this context natural philosophy or science, and superstition. Superstition is much more bold in its hypotheses than philosophy, he said, and while the latter contents itself with assigning new causes and principles to the phenomena which appear in the visible world, the former opens a world of its own, and presents us with scenes, and beings, and objects, which are altogether new. Since, therefore, 'tis almost impossible for the mind of man to rest, like those of beasts, in the narrow circle of objects, which are the subject of daily conversation and action, we ought only to deliberate concerning the choice of our guide, and not to prefer that which is safest and most agreeable. The methods of science are the safest guide, for they allow us to assent only to that which is substantiated by actual experience, and with regard to that, they renounce dogmatism, and are prepared to alter or modify whatever is concluded, in the light of further experience. We should always be cautious, Hume declared, in the use of such terms as these: "'Tis evident, 'tis certain, 'tis undeniable," which a due deference to the public ought, perhaps, to prevent. On the other hand, such expressions are freely used to recommend speculations which have no other basis than a warm imagination. While a warm imagination is allowed to enter into philosophy, he said, and hypotheses embraced merely for being specious and agreeable, we can never have any steady principles, nor any sentiments, which will suit with common practice and experience. But were these hypotheses once removed, we might hope to establish a system of opinions, which if not true, for that, perhaps, is too much to be hoped for, might at least be satisfactory to the human mind, and might stand the test of the most critical examination. For my part, my only hope is, that I may contribute a little to the advancement of knowledge, by giving in some particulars a different turn to the speculations of philosophers, and pointing out to them more distinctly those subjects, where alone they can expect assurance and conviction. In his inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume finished with a more forceful statement of this same conclusion: when we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make, if we take in our hand any volume, of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance? Let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. 4. Justification by faith. Whatever Hume may have had to say about the fallibility of demonstrations, it is evident from the record that his own conclusions were reached only by accepting and following up Locke's contention that the mind has no other object than its own perceptions, and Berkeley's that there is no way of comparing these with external objects existing independently of what is present in the mind. If this premise is disallowed, then the whole of Hume's argument is disallowed with it. Yet the premise itself hardly falls under the headings of either abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number, or experimental reasoning. Despite his apparent consistency, therefore, there was still inconsistency at the heart of Hume's philosophy. But leaving this point aside for discussion later on, it is equally evident that, with Hume, Berkeley's pious endeavor to justify belief in God had come to grief. Hume did quite conclusively show that from Berkeley's premises no demonstration of the existence of God followed, but nor did any demonstration of God's non-existence. And certainly, according to Hume, a materialist view of the world was as lacking foundation as a theological view. Hume was, in fact, the first, as well as by far the greatest of the agnostics. Hume's own attitude to religion was negative. He regarded it as superstition, and as socially injurious inasmuch as it encouraged intolerant zeal. Generally speaking, he said, the errors in religion are dangerous, those in philosophy only ridiculous. But he was opposed to zeal of any description, and he deprecated that of the materialists equally with that of religious enthusiasts. His writings on miracles, on immortality, and on natural religion, were much applauded by all the anti-clerical zealots of his own and subsequent times. Yet they were disappointed that, even though in an ironical tone, he always inserted small saving clauses into his demonstrations of the lack of evidence for any religious beliefs. At the end of the inquiry concerning human understanding, he remarked of religious belief that its best and most solid foundation is faith in divine revelation. At the end of his essay on immortality he remarked, nothing could set in a fuller light the infinite obligations which mankind have to divine revelation, since we find that no other medium could ascertain this great important truth. And at the end of his dialogues concerning natural religion he made the principal speaker conclude, a person seasoned with a just sense of the imperfections of natural reason, will fly to revealed truth with the greatest avidity. To be a philosophical skeptic is, in a man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound believing Christian. Hume's intention in making these remarks was, perhaps, mainly to provoke, but at the same time he was sticking to his brief by showing that, while he could find no matter of fact evidence to justify religious belief, he could find none to contradict it either, and that while proofs of the existence of God were impossible and refutations were impossible too. He might have been surprised had he known that later on a whole school of Protestant theologians would take his polite sarcasms quite seriously, and proclaim faith and faith alone as the foundation of religion, and that dozens of the most eminent men of science would justify their faith in all kinds of religious hocus-pocus by his skeptical doctrine, that the unavoidable limitations of scientific knowledge left all questions of the meaning or purpose of life to be decided in the light of faith alone, because science had no bearing upon them. Though this was not his intention, Hume in fact continued and completed the work of Berkeley in the matter of the reconciliation of science and religion. He agreed that the object of scientific knowledge is nothing but our own sense impressions. He corrected the extravagance of Berkeley, who had tried to make out that the observable order in our sense impressions was proof of the existence of God. But equally, he reinforced Berkeley's own refutation of extravagant claims made on behalf of science. Men of science were deluded if they supposed that their investigations led to the discovery of material causes, which were the ultimate and operating principle, as something which resides in the external object. Period. Science, therefore, can discover nothing that can possibly conflict with religion. A scientist can be religious or not, as he chooses. His researches simply throw no light at all on the truth or otherwise of religious faith. On the other hand, the religious man has no cause to fear or quarrel with science. In the first period of the development of modern natural science, it took up arms against religious obscurantism. The philosophy which Hume developed from Berkeley meant that science was now to be disarmed. It was to lay aside any claim to represent a true and expanding picture of the real nature of things, of natural history, the forces at work in the world, and the explanation of events. 5. Morals and Reason. The main upshot of Hume's work was the production of a lay philosophy, scientific in outlook, entirely free from any theological trappings. but equally free from making any claim that the sciences could discover the objective causes or operating principle of events. The external object lay quite outside the possible sphere of human knowledge. At the same time, Hume thought that by observation, unprejudiced by preconceived opinions, we could find out enough about human nature as will suit with common practice and experience. Human nature is the only science of man, he said, and yet has been hitherto most neglected. Hume was one of the principal architects of that characteristic form of humanism which, while considering that the proper study of mankind is man, refusing to see man as subject to any extra-human purposes, and judging everything as it affects human interests, at the same time considers human beings only as they exist within the confines of bourgeois society, taking this mode of existence as the one naturally conformable to human nature. From this standpoint, Hume turned his attention to questions of morality and government. He considered it evident that men are moved to action not by reason but by passion, and considering his own demonstrations of the limitations of reason, this conclusion was not unreasonable. From this he immediately deduced that the rules of morality are not conclusions of a reason, for morals have an influence on the actions and affections, whereas reason alone, as we have already proved, can never have any such influence. 3. From this he went on to a second conclusion. Morality consists not in any relations that are the objects of science. It consists not in any matter of fact. Take any action allowed to be vicious, Hume argued, examine it in all lights, and see if you can find that matter of fact, or real existence, which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you, as long as you consider the object. You can never find it, till you turn your reflection into your own breast, and find a sentiment of disapprobation, which arises in you, towards this action, so that when you pronounce any action to be vicious, you mean nothing, but that from the constitution of your nature you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it, and so he concluded, morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of. It is, therefore, entirely impossible that any moral conclusions, or any value judgments, as philosophers say now, should be validly derived from matters of fact. There can be no valid conclusion from fact to value. In every system of morality that I have hitherto met with, said Hume, I have always remarked, that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, when of a sudden I am surprised to find, that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is, and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought, or not, but as this expresses some new relation or affirmation, it seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. 3. Why are some things judged good and others bad? Why do we say that some actions ought to be done and others ought not? Hume considered that this was simply due to the pleasure or pain which they afford us by the mere view and contemplation. At the same time, moral judgments are not based on purely individual or selfish considerations. A concurrence of moral judgment occurs in society, because of human sympathy, which renders the contemplation of the pain or pleasure of others painful or pleasant to oneself. Sympathy is a very powerful principle in human nature which has force sufficient to give us a strongest sentiments of approbation, as in the case of justice, allegiance, chastity, and good manners. Of course, these views of Hume about morality were taken by many to be extremely immoral, inasmuch as they contradicted traditional dogmas to the effect that morality was founded on the communions of God, or on certainties guaranteed by reason, or on infallible moral intuitions. Yet they were very far indeed from having any tendency to overthrow accepted moral standards. By saying that ought could not be deduced from is, Hume certainly did not imply that we ought not to say ought. On the contrary, moral judgments are practical ones, which people living in society cannot in practice avoid or ignore. Hume simply sought to correct the warm imagination of partisans and fanatics, of sectaries of all sorts, whether these were people overzealous for established authority or, on the other hand, people seeking to subvert the establishment in the name of new principles and reasons which they supposed to have been revealed to them. The whole force of his argument was in favor of those standards of justice, allegiance, chastity and good manners which had come to be generally accepted in his society, and which had won approbation, as he supposed, as a result of experience and of their being conformable to human nature. 6. Improving the ancient fabric. What Hume had to say about political questions was said in his essays, and it was short, and very much to the point. He was a Tory in politics, all that moderate variety inspired more by a conviction that it is best to let well alone than by any conviction of the sanctity of established institutions, and served for some years with distinction as secretary to the British Embassy in France. His principal aversion was to any kind of enthusiasm or excess, whether of the left or of the right. Locke had deduced how government ought to be constituted from the alleged fact that governments were instituted to protect property. Hume doubted whether this was even a fact. Government, he said, commences more casually and more imperfectly, of the origin of government. But in any case, such inferences from is to ought are without foundation. It is, he said, on opinion only that government is founded, of the first principles of government. All governments have their conveniences and inconveniences, and in all governments, there is a perpetual intestine struggle, open or secret, between authority and liberty, and neither of them can ever absolutely prevail in the contest of the origin of government. The only wise course is, therefore, to seek to preserve that government which has been in practice found most convenient. We should avoid reforms and innovations which claim to be founded on reason but are in reality merely doctrinaire. Let us cherish and improve our ancient government as much as possible, Hume concluded, without encouraging a passion for dangerous novelties of the first principles of government. An established government has an infinite advantage, by that very circumstance, of its being established. To tamper, therefore, in this affair merely upon the credit of supposed argument and philosophy, can never be the part of a wise magistrate, and though he may attempt some improvement for the public good, yet he will adjust his innovations as much as possible to the ancient fabric, and preserve entire the chief pillars and supports of the Constitution idea of a perfect commonwealth. This is exactly the same argument as Burke afterwards produced, with more prolixity, against the French Bill of Citoyenneté, as still serves today as the foundation stone of British conservatism. When Hume was with the British Embassy in Paris, he came into close contact with the revolutionary thinkers of the French Enlightenment. They were attracted by his skeptical attitude to religion, but repelled by the same attitude applied to social questions, including his readiness to tolerate clerics while still believing them peddlers of superstition. For his part, he deplored their evident desire to turn society upside down in the name of truth and of the rights of man deduced from a materialist philosophy. He deplored their theories of the perfectibility of men and of the power of reason. Those who are conscious of wrong and oppression must always try to penetrate in their thoughts to its causes, and to justify their revolutionary proposals by an appeal to objective truth. Hume contended that we could never possess any cogent demonstration of such truth, and condemned revolutionaries as enthusiasts carried away by their own brand of superstition. Like Locke, he deprecated any pretensions to be able to discover the objective causes behind the appearances, but he carried forward this deprecation with far greater force and consistency than Locke. Locke was still concerned with the completion of a bourgeois revolution. With Hume there emerged an attitude very well content with the existing social order. The whole record shows that this philosophy, as it was developed from Locke's doctrine of ideas, is socially conservative, well suited to the defense of an established bourgeois order. For when revolutionaries proclaim that a scientific method of thinking points the way to social innovation, including in their programs derivations of ought from is, this philosophy claims to show conclusively that no method of scientific thought can ever possibly justify such pretensions. It can never possibly justify the undermining of either state or church, and if it seems to do so, that is only the irrational delusion of dogmatic enthusiasts. Chapter 3, Th. Philosophy.